Right, and we are live, so welcome everyone. And Shyla, you can take it away.
Perfect. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I am so excited to talk today to Rosie Dannon, author of The Intimacy Experiment, and Andy J. Christopher, author of Hot Under His Collar, and Uzma Jalaluddin, author of Hana Khan Carries On. So to start, welcome everyone first. Thank you so much for joining us. Can you each give us a quick rundown of what your book is about? Uzma, I guess we'll start with you.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Uzma Jalaluddin, and I'm the author of Hana Khan Carries On, which is right behind me. My first book was Aisha at Last. And Hana Khan Carries On, I'll give you the log line. It's basically You've Got Mail, but set in rival halal restaurants within a very close-knit Muslim community in Toronto.
Perfect. Rosie, what about you?
Yeah, hi there, everyone. I'm Rosie. I write contemporary romance about millennial misadventures in love. My debut, The Roommate, came out in September 2020, and then just on Tuesday of last week, The Intimacy Experiment came out. It's a companion novel to The Roommate. It follows a CEO who is a former sex worker who joins forces with a hot rabbi to teach a course on modern intimacy, and they actually end up using that syllabus to fall in love.
Very good stuff. Andy?
Hi, I'm Andy J. Christopher, and my upcoming book that's out in July is Hot Under His Collar. If you read either Not the Girl You Marry or Not That Kind of Guy, you met Father Patrick, the #hot priest. And I didn't really set out to, when I started Not the Girl You Marry, to write a romance with Hot Priest, but enough people asked about it, and he felt like he needed a story. So it's about Father Patrick, who is the pastor of a small, struggling parish in Chicago, and Sasha Finnerty, who is a friend who's helping him save a pre-K program from a cut in funding.
Yes. So, as you guys mentioned, you've all written books before, but I feel like these are the first ones that really center around religion or have religion as a theme within your books. And something that I noticed collectively is that they feature characters who are on varying degrees of a spectrum in terms of their religious identity. So in Hana Khan Carries On, she seems very secure in her faith, whereas in The Intimacy Experiment, Naomi is reacquainting herself with Judaism and dipping her toe back into the water, so to speak. And meanwhile, in Hot Under His Collar, Father Patrick is on the completely opposite end and is questioning his tenure and seemingly very permanent commitment to God. So first, I guess, Andy, you touched on this a little bit, but why did you all make religion a theme in your books, in these books in particular? And why did you place the characters where they are in their journey with their faith? Let's see. Andy, why don't we start with you?
So I never set out to make religion a theme in my work, but I think a lot of my work centers around because I grew up Catholic and I grew up, half my family's Irish Catholic, it just sort of seeped into my work in a lot of ways. And so I think having a priest character show up as Jack's conscience in the first book kind of set me off thinking what kind of millennial human being would decide to become a priest, and what would go into that decision. And so I just got really curious about it. I myself am not a practicing Catholic, but it's still very much a part of my culture. And some of the tenets of the religion dictates some of my ethics. And so sort of kindness, generosity, community, those are all important things to me. And those kind of all are very important things to Patrick, and they're sort of his impetus for and his purpose. And so I wanted to write about someone who decides to separate that purpose from their religion and how that plays out. I also, I think not being a practicing Catholic kind of gave me the freedom to think about that. I didn't want to if I were still very religious, I think the fear of getting excommunicated would have prevented me from writing the book. So
Oh, yes, there are definitely some spicy things in there. I think would have been a red flag for some people.
Yes, yes. So it's I like there's nothing that's like a huge trigger warning, but if you are like very like it might just not jive if you're very, very committed and practicing. So, or it could. Depends.
You never know.
It's a big time Catholicism.
Rosie, what about you? Again, just going to repeat the question, but why did you make religion a theme in this book in particular, and why did you place the characters where they are in their journey with their faith?
Yeah, for me, I think it was like a couple of different themes that I wanted to explore intersecting. I will say, like, the first sort of inkling that religion would be a theme that I would need to explore here is that I actually had a really short amount of time to figure out who the love interest would be for Naomi. We were on submission with the roommate. They were like, we're interested. Do you have any other ideas for books in this series? And my agent was like, Naomi should have a book. And so I think I literally had like 48 hours to be like, who's the pairing for this complicated woman that I've created? And I was trying to figure out like who could be her match, and the idea of a hot rabbi like came to me like pretty instantly, and the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Like, again, to me, like, I thought Naomi needs somebody that shares her core values, and one of her like really driving values at the stage in her life is she wants to build more inclusive communities. She's doing that work every day. She's breathing it. It's something she's super passionate about, and like a rabbi is doing that. That's like a core part of their functionality. She is somebody that has very strong opinions. She needs someone that is going to meet her challenges with respect. Rabbis are really used to like challenging ideas and questioning and analyzing. So in a lot of ways, again, I know that on paper, probably people are like, you took a sex worker and a rabbi and you thought that was the like least common denominator.
Though. It works.
Yeah, again, for me, it was like, this makes perfect sense. So then once I had a rabbi as the love interest, I knew that, you know, Naomi's relationship with her Jewish heritage was going to come up. She was going to have to explore this in order to be in a relationship with someone who has such a deep connection with his Jewish heritage, and also was like practicing it obviously in such a huge way. And it was an opportunity for me to explore something that was very much at the forefront of my mind, which is this idea about the intersection of identities. Like, how do we reconcile who we were in the past, who we want to become, and to kind of find the seams of all of our different selves. Because I don't know about everyone else, but like, I have like a work self and I have a friend self and things like that. And they, as you get older, they come together. So this was an opportunity for her to go on a journey and for me to dive back in. Oh, sorry, my boyfriend's texting me. I will tell him to stop. But it was a good opportunity for me to like dive into these Jewish texts and to have conversations with Jewish leaders in a way that I had not done for a very long time. And so it ended up being a really meaningful parallel in the process of writing it and bringing her character journey on the page.
Nice. And Uzma, I feel like yours is unique because, you know, I don't think that Hannah really is struggling with her faith. She struggles with other things for sure. But, you know, she seems very secure. So can you talk a little bit about that choice and what you went with there?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So Hannah Khan is the protagonist of Hannah Khan Carries On, of course. And she's a young woman. She's 24 years old. And just as you said, she's very secure in her faith. And that kind of came about because I wanted to really write about a Muslim character who, like, the point of the story is not really about her faith and her identity, but more about the outwardness of how that manifests. So she is a young woman whose family, like the whole "you've got mail" conceit of the book, is basically her family runs an Indian restaurant and has done so for about 15 years, when a new sort of like hipster halal place opens up down the street. And then they have this sort of back and forth enemies to lovers type of interaction. But outside of that, Hannah herself is a young graduate. She's majored in broadcasting, and she's working in a radio station. And so her identity as a Muslim, as the daughter of immigrants from India, really push up against this idea of how exactly do we tell our stories in a way that is accessible to people outside of our culture and our faith. And when I was writing the book, I really wanted to sort of describe a neighborhood very close to the sort of neighborhood where I grew up. I grew up in a suburb of just east of Toronto called Scarborough. And I think the closest comparison would be like Queens, New York. It's just very diverse, lots of people from basically all over the world, but a very large concentration of people from Asia and the Caribbean. And I grew up attending a very, close-knit mosque that I still attend. I was, and my family has very tight roots to that. And I thought, both of my books actually are centered in this sort of idea of community, which I think is something that both Rosie and Andy were alluding to. And I think when we talk about faith in the modern context, what we're really talking about is where do you belong, where you feel you're most authentic and you're most comfortable. And for Hannah, that is within her. I name it's a fictional neighborhood. It's called the Golden Crescent neighborhood because like crescent Muslim and then golden because gold is awesome. So I really describe that sense of, because I feel like, especially for as a novelist who is visibly Muslim, I just don't see a lot of stories that are rooted in my culture and my faith. And the stories that are rooted in the Muslim tradition tend to be very patronizing. The female character oftentimes is only freed once she takes off her hijab or she, starts dating a white boy or something like that. But I was like, but I know so many love stories that are rooted within the faith and rooted within the culture. And like, let's explore that. Let's see what that looks like, especially for someone who's young. So the idea of Hannah Khan being 24 years old and having this like self-confidence in her identity, but then trying to relay that to the world was really interesting to me.
And, just something that you said, but like we really need stories that look like the world we live in, and that's something that I think you all are doing in your books. And we're gonna come back to that. But in romance novels, we often see characters struggle to take a leap of faith and love, and when you add religion into the mix, suddenly they aren't just putting their faith in the other person or in the relationship, but also in something much larger. So how do you think, if at all, one's relationship to God, or at least in your character's point of view, impacts their overall outlook on love? Andy, back to you.
Okay. So I think in a lot of ways, sort of pop culture is sort of like soaked in like sort of Christian content and Catholic content, and like, sort of like the stereotypical sort of Irish or Italian family. And so I wanted to sort of explore, especially when we're talking about Sasha, whose family is like nominally Catholic, but they kind of use like their membership in the church as a way to climb socially. And Sasha, went to Notre Dame, and so she's in it. So I think she's sort of trying to break free of her family's version of religion and figure out where she belongs. And I think her falling in love with a priest and having to ask him to leave God for her, and having sort of like the faith that he'll do that, and that they can sort of like, and I think over the course of the 3 books, I've tried to say, okay, so these are adults sort of making their own found family around like the Nolans and their neighborhood. And I think that was sort of like the thrust of the novel. So I think there are so many amazing inspirational authors who write about specifically like within the Judeo-Christian or within just Christianity, the relationship with God and the relationship between the two people. I think Piper Hughley and Vanessa Riley are 2 great examples of authors who are very like pro-religion. And so I think this book was more about finding humanity, finding community, and like loving one's own humanity. And so I think Patrick sort of learns how to love his own humanity, and not have to give everything of himself away in order to feel like he's a valuable person.
Yeah. No, it totally does. It's a lot because, these are, well-rounded characters. But Rosie, what about you? How does religion impact your character's outlook on love?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question that does feel like very open-ended to me, even having written the book. And there's different characters who have different relationships with their Judaism within the story. So like Ethan, who's the rabbi, like he originally kind of reconnects with his idea of Jewish practice because he was a physicist and he's trained to question things, and he sort of connects with religion as a way to process his grief. He finds comfort in the traditions after his father's passing, and then he starts to view it in a new light of like, this is another opportunity to question. This is something that fits really closely within his framework of how he processes the world. And then with Naomi, I think it's all about finding entry points, like re-entry points that feel relevant to her current experiences. And I think Ethan does his best to for not just Naomi, but for anyone within the community. That's what he wants to do, is he wants to find the pieces of tradition, or even if it's like something from the Jewish mystics, like something that will speak to where they are in that moment. And he gets to Naomi and in different ways, like he talks to her about like, what does it mean to make art, and like, what's our relationship to art? And that's like something that's very relevant to her that she can sink her teeth into, and it becomes a gateway to embracing more parts of her heritage. And then she also just like studies, like she's an academic, and when we meet her in The Roommate, that continues in this book, like completely independent of her relationship with Ethan, which I think is really important to her. Like she goes to a completely different synagogue to reconnect and to learn. And I think that's something that appeals to her, is this opportunity to she likes to be in charge of her own growth. And I think, the synagogue that she takes part in makes that possible for her.
Yeah, and something you said just about like being open, I feel like as she's open to learning more about, religion and her culture, like she's also opening up to Ethan and, letting love into her life. So I definitely think it goes hand in hand. Uzma, what about you? How do you think religion impacts your character's outlook on love?
For me, both of my main characters, Hannah and her love interest, Aiden. So Aiden, of course, is the person who owns the restaurant down the street that's open, the hipster halal restaurant. And he's also, through a pseudonym, the person that she's communicating with online, because she's a podcaster, and she posts transcripts of, she posts her episodes of her podcast, and he is a commenter. Both of them are actually observant Muslims. And so they're kind of like, their faith is sort of just humming along in the background. And because of that, a lot of things sort of become shorthand between the two of them. So for instance, the idea of like, there's a couple of scenes in the mosque. So Hannah goes to like Friday prayers, and then Aiden also goes to Friday prayers, because that's your local mosque. That's where you're going to go and do that. Not to give a spoiler, but there is a death in the book, and the funeral rites, which I've never ever seen sort of described, like what is a Muslim funeral, what does that look like, is described, or various things like that. And so for Hannah and Aiden, who were two young Muslims who were basically falling in love for the first time with each other, their religious shorthand is a way for them to know that they have a certain foundation. They have, like the way that in other books you might have characters who bond over a shared hobby. Not to say that their faith is a shared hobby, but it's definitely sort of a mutual identity that they can both use as a springboard. And one of the reasons why I wrote the book in this way, so my first novel, Aisha at Last, my main character Khalid is like very stern, very religious. It's a Pride and Prejudice retelling set in a Muslim neighborhood, and so he's very obvious in his Muslimness. Like he dresses like an extra from Homeland, like he's got the white robe and like all of that kind of stuff. But with Hannah Khan, Aiden is not like that. He's always described as wearing like really casual clothing and with like jeans and t-shirts and things like that. And Hannah, of course, wears hijab, but their faith is just a part of them, and they walk in faith throughout their entire life. And it's not even really a part of the story, and I did that on purpose. What does become a part of the story is again the way that other people perceive them. So there is a hate crime in their neighborhood in the book. They are attacked when they go to downtown Toronto, and then the hate crime kind of follows them back home into their very close-knit, diverse neighborhood, and that really shakes both Hannah and Aiden and the rest of their neighborhood's kind of idea of like, who are we? Are we a target? What are we doing to kind of invite this hate? What can we do to stand against this hate? And it's very much Islamophobia in action. So for me, it was really important, however, to show Hannah as someone who's really comfortable in her skin, who's really comfortable as someone who is a Muslim. Because again, coming back to the thing I was saying before, a lot of times Muslim characters in fiction are shown as having friction with their faith. And I just wanted to explore a character who doesn't have that friction, because I know that exists and I know that's a natural part of growing up. But Hannah, on the other hand, is just like, she's got other problems. She's got tons of other problems, but that's not one of them.
And you touched on it already, but that was my next question, is not only do these characters deal with their personal relationship to faith, but we get to see society's relationship to that faith as well, specifically in terms of bias. And like you mentioned, there's a racially fueled hate crime in your book, and for Naomi and the Intimacy Experiment, it's a protest against her past as a sex worker and being involved in trying to educate just new people coming to the synagogue. And for Patrick, it's the actual institution of the Catholic Church as a whole. And, it stands on LGBTQ relationships, as well as its controversy surrounding sexism and racism and abuse. And these are all true to real life, of course, but they're also really heavy issues to tackle. So I was wondering, how do they affect the overall tone of your books? And I guess, how do you manage that? Rosie, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard, and it's hard to balance. Like, this book is coming out, The Intimacy Experiment, when anti-Semitism is more prevalent than it's ever been in my lifetime, at least. And I didn't want to create something where Jewish readers were going to be harmed. Like, it was really important to me that this book feel like a safe space for them. But at the same time, I don't think it does anyone a service to deny the realities of being Jewish in the world, being a sex worker in the world, how those things come together in Naomi's case. So it was really about, I try not to dwell in that pain. And unfortunately, I think for a lot of Jewish people and for myself, like, you encounter casual anti-Semitism, and it always is incredibly painful, but I don't know, I guess in some ways, I don't think it will be as shocking. So I try not to dwell in it, but I wanted it to be an authentic experience. I think it wouldn't have been right to not show that, there are people who don't necessarily support progressive movements within different faith. And there's people, actually one of my Jewish beta readers was like, you should put the words anti-Semitism on the page. I hadn't even realized that at one point I was avoiding saying that. And I think that it was important that I do that because, naming things as what they are is important to call attention to them.
Yeah. And, just thinking about your book in particular, I know there was a scene when, I guess it was like a flashback, and we see that, she's, I guess, called a name, or a character when she's younger, like, says something offensive, and it sticks with her throughout the rest of her life. And she sort of hides this part of herself moving forward. And I think that she steals herself in terms of being prepared for comments about her sex work, but doesn't really do that for her faith, because it hasn't really been a part of her life. And so she has to sort of grapple with that. But Andy, what about you and Patrick's relationship to the Catholic Church and that bias there?
What I think I really wanted to do was to sort of talk about how there are like good people within an institution that I think, to me, has like proved itself to be kind of rotten in a lot of ways. Like growing up, I had like a great priest who was like, one of my mom's friends decided she was getting older and she wanted to have a baby, and she decided to seek out a sperm donor. And that's definitely frowned upon within the Catholic Church, but she went to go talk to our priest, and he basically asked her if she and God were okay with it. And he was like, well, then I'm not going to like say that this is wrong. And also I had a friend, like I have a close family friend who went through a divorce, and she's very Catholic, and she talked to like a woman who was like sort of talking her through getting a divorce from Rome. And she said the metaphor, like, so Patrick gives this metaphor about a puzzle, and like puzzles are sort of a theme, and it came from this friend in this sort of like counseling session. So I think through like Patrick and Sister Cortona, I really wanted to show that there were good people who wanted to help people within the church. And, you know, sometimes it doesn't work out for them to do that within the church. And so I think, you know, no spoilers, I think Patrick, you know, has a path moving forward where he can contribute a lot of the same things. So, and I definitely wasn't going to put, you know, a pedophile priest on the page in a romantic comedy. Like, I don't think that's the space to hold that. But I tried to show through the Archbishop, like how that kind of bias and anti-LGBTQ attitude persists within the church, because it's a political institution, and political institutions are usually bad, you know, on some level, in a lot of ways. Political institutions, you can't put your faith in that. You have to put your faith in like the actual people, and you can't always trust who the institution says to put faith in. And so I just, you know, I wanted Sister Cortona there to keep everybody honest. Also, she's really funny. So
I loved her.
like a mean, funny nun who like, you know, drinks and swears. And so I really wanted to show that like, yeah, there's good people, and, you know, but, you know, the institution still has a long way to go before it's truly a welcoming home for a lot of the people who were raised in the faith.
But I think what you said about just like being honest is really true. You know, it's like they, even though Patrick and Sister Cartonia, like they know that there are problems, it doesn't, and, you know, obviously they question things, but it doesn't change what's important at the core, you know,
yeah, right.
Helping people and things like that. So, yeah, I think that that's very true. And Uzma, you already touched a little bit about the attack that happens in your book, but can you talk a little bit about, you know, go into a little bit more how this actually affects your characters, because, you know, they're within this tight-knit community, so they're not really othered on a daily basis. And then when they go outside of this community, they're really othered. And, you know, there's a scene where I think she's talking to her boss, and her boss is like, I can't believe this happened in downtown Toronto. And it's like, yeah, you know, so can you talk a little bit about how that impacts your characters?
Yeah, for sure. Actually, it's interesting because you know, my book just came out in Canada last week. It's coming out tomorrow in the United States. Yay! And so like early reviews and ARCs are coming out, and a lot of people have, a lot of readers have said, you know, the first half of this book, I thought I was reading just a rom-com, right? Like your typical, okay, you've got male halal restaurants, and then all of a sudden it's like it just turns on a dime. Halfway through the book, they basically, you know, no spoilers, but they go downtown and something happens, something horrible happens, and it's a race motivated attack. It's an Islamophobic attack, I should say, and all of a sudden it's a different book. And the reason why I did that, I didn't want to. A friend of mine read it, and, you know, she's a teacher like me, and something, you know, something horrible happened to her recently, but she was like, I was triggered by this. You know, it just kind of reminded me of something that happened to me in my class recently. And I think that's life, you know, like as a person of color, as a visible Muslim, I could be really comfortable in my neighborhood walking down the street, and I don't know who. I have to be very aware of the people around me, even as I am comfortable presenting myself in all of my intersectionalities and all of my different identities. I think that people of color sometimes move through the world in a different way, with that awareness of who's watching us and who is maybe getting a little bit too close to us. But when something as dramatic as what happened to Hannah Khan happens, it does sort of shift the narrative in a way. And oftentimes you don't hear that perspective from a Muslim character, right? So they are always the victim of the crime, but you don't really see that inner reflection of like, what does that happen? How does that shake you? And Hannah's a really confident person. She comes from a community that supports her. She does wear hijab, so she is visible, but she's not, like you said, it's not thrown in her face all the time because she lives in a community where a lot of people wear hijab, or a lot of people are racialized or marginalized in some way. It's just kind of they're the majority in their neighborhood. So when this happens to her, and then the hate crime kind of almost follows her home a little bit later on in the book, she has to confront the idea, which she's always aware of as a Muslim and as a South Asian daughter of immigrants, that, you know, maybe the world doesn't always see her in that way. But there is also support. There's a lot of allies. There's a lot of good. And so sometimes I feel like I wrote a book that was, I think at its core, it's a very authentic, it's a real book, but there's a part of this book that is very angry. And I think I was trying to channel that anger, and there's still a lot of jokes. There's still definitely a love story. And it has a hopeful ending. But I wanted to kind of give space to all the Muslims that I know who have experienced this, whether it was an obvious attack like what happened to Hannah Khan, or the smaller microaggressions that she faces at her work in radio, because those sometimes sort of chip away at your sense of self and your sense of identity in a way that is, in the long term, even more harmful than the absolute in-your-face violence of some of these attacks. So I wanted to kind of explore both. But my book is still funny and it's a love story.
It is. There was one line that really stuck out to me, which is so heartbreaking, is that, you know, like you said, she does wear hijab, and, you know, that she talks about how that makes her almost a target. But there was a part where she was like, maybe I shouldn't have worn my favorite color one. Maybe I should have worn one with like a maple leaf to be like, I belong here. And that was just so heartbreaking, because it's like, she's obviously very secure in her faith, but, you know, her identity as a Canadian, and, you know, as like you mentioned, like the daughter of immigrants, but like she was born in Canada, and like she is Canadian. And, you know, even her mom goes into talking about like, oh, well, this is just something we experience. Like, you have it better than I did. And you see the trickle down effects. And, you know, even her sister, who she would had to give up soccer because of the ban of, you know, being able to wear any type of headgear when she plays, and how that might affect her having her own child. So you really see other layers to the identity. And it's just that scene, I was like, no, it's not your fault, people suck.
It happens so often, right? Like the immediate reaction is like, oh, what did I do wrong, right? Like, what did I do wrong? I need to do something different. So yeah. It was,
yeah. Okay, so I want to switch gears, and we've got to talk about sex very briefly. So tell me, how does religion impact the heat of your books? Because they're all very different degrees. But, you know, and there was, even if there's not sex on the page, there's still tension, and it's still steamy in its own right. So can we talk a little bit about how you tackle that? Andy, I just finished yours last night, so it's right at the top of my mind. Can you talk about some of those scenes?
So I gotta preface this by saying, this is the slowest burn I ever wrote. And I went in knowing that. I literally sat down with Kate Claiborne and I was like, how am I gonna write a slow burn? Like, usually I write fast incendiary burns. And so I, like, obviously there is like sexual interaction on the page. There's breaking of taboos, but it's part of like the slow progression of the unraveling of Patrick's vocation. So I was just like, how do I show like the sort of chemistry and heat between these two characters while they're doing something, you know, very, very wholesome as friends. And I think, you know, the scene in the bar that people keep texting me about.
It's a scene. I read it more than once. I had to keep going back, like, did that really happen? Oh, that happened.
Yeah, so the bar scene, I was writing, I was like, well, I'm about halfway through, like, you know, like something's, I don't want them to like just kiss because I feel that's weird. But I kept trying to come up with, I was like, but something's gotta give. And so
It did.
yes. So that scene just kind of like came up, and I sent it to a friend who writes like really, really high heat indie romance. And I was like, I think this is the hottest thing I've ever written. And she was like, I think you might be right. And it just felt right there. So, and it felt like, there had to be like a line in the sand where they knew that, their continued interaction was crossing lines. And so that was the line in the sand.
Yep. Oh, Rosie, what about you?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think people who are not as familiar with Judaism like might think that, a rabbi and a priest are like fair comparisons in terms of the intersection of like sex and religion, but Judaism is like a very different idea about how sex is honored within the practice of Judaism. And so I would say that for sure the intimacy experiment is slower burn, less volume of sex scenes than the roommate. Although I like to think that the ones that they have get pretty high heat. But I would say that that's actually a reflection of Naomi more than it's a reflection of Ethan. And it's very much because this book is about her journey and her growth, I would say, first and foremost. And she already knows that she's really good at sex, and she already knows it's like an area that she feels confident in. And so the book is more about her challenging herself in a lot of other areas that make up intimacy. And I think that's one of the themes of the book, that like sex can be a part of intimacy, but it's not the be all end all of intimacy. And so they really do find connection in a lot of other ways. Although I will definitely say like Ethan, I tend to write like soft boys with dirty mouths. And I think he has some lines that I'm really proud of in terms of bedroom scenes.
And in your book, there's a scene where they're sitting next to each other, literally not touching. And I thought it was the hottest scene in the book. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, everyone has to read it. It was very steamy and they do not touch. I was like, wow. Uzma, what about you and your characters?
So my book is probably on the opposite extreme. It's very, I guess it's a very sweet romance, very, very low heat. I think the most that they do is hold hands, and one of them kind of cups the other's face. So it's very much like that. And it was a deliberate choice. I wanted to really focus on, for me, the fun of reading romance novels. As much as I enjoy reading all of the very hot scenes, I also really love the buildup. And I'm all about the slowest of slow burns. And it's like, if the slow burn kind of takes you to the end of the book, I'm okay with that. So that's definitely the case with Hannah and Aiden in Hannah Khan Carries On. And it's all about the sort of restrained sensuality, the way that they look at each other, the way that they think of each other, the romantic little gestures that kind of take them to building a more of a relationship. And they also, it's easy because they start off as enemies, right? So they're trying to destroy each other. And then, so it's not normal for them to kind of immediately amp up the heat. And also in my book, they actually turn from enemies to friends, and they spend a lot of time as friends and allies, and sort of like confronting these issues that are happening, and then at the very end they sort of get together. So yeah, I don't know what my third book will be like, but my first two books have definitely been very low on the outward heat. But I think at the same time they do explore sensuality, because for instance, for Muslims, sex is considered a very healthy, normal part of life, and so we don't really shy away from it. We do discuss it a lot. Just even within the faith, it's not considered like a taboo. It's considered something that is like a natural outlet, and something really healthy and necessary if you're into sex, and if you're not, that's fine too. So
no, but when you talk about the little moments, like there's a scene where, he buys her ice cream and doesn't even say anything or look at her, but he just like knows that it's something that she needs and gets the right flavor. Or there was a part where she takes his sunglasses and, won't give them back, but it's like just a little keepsake for her. And I really like those sweet moments. And I think I almost think it anchors everything, you know, because they're dealing with so many other things, and they are competitors and they are enemies, and they do have this secret relationship with each other that they don't even know that they have. So there's a lot of other stuff going on. Okay, so now I'm not Muslim, I'm not Jewish, and I'm not Catholic. That being said, I related to each of your books. So you talked about this a little bit already, but I guess how much did you actually consider who your audience was going to be? And did you make any deliberate choices in your writing in terms of possibly educating readers about a religion they may not know about? Uzma, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, sure. It's funny. I feel like I really evolved on this subject myself as a writer. Like I know when I was writing my first book, the first few drafts of Aisha at Last, they had a lot of there's a lot of explanatory comments. You know, like this is what this means. This is what this means. And then because my first book took me so long to write, I feel like I evolved and I got into the mindset of just like I think people will be able to figure out a lot of this type of terminology just from the context, you know, like simple words like what's a rishta, what's a nikah, what's like chai, do I have to define it? That's a cup of tea to everyone? I don't think I need to, because you can Google it, right? If you're really interested, you can look it up. But that being said, there are some contextual clues that need a little bit more description. So for instance, the Muslim prayer service on Friday is equivalent to, you know, the Saturday Shabbat service or the Sunday service, right? So like things like that needed a little bit of clarification. And even like the use of italics, you know, do I need to italicize every word that's not like an English word that people would know about? And I found that as I continued to write, I became a little bit stingier with my use of italics, because I just figured if it's in the dictionary, you can look it up. It's fine. And through that process, I realized that my audience, first of all, my audience is always myself. Like I always write my first drafts for myself, because I kind of stay with my books for so long and they kind of live in my head for sometimes years before I even start writing them. And so, and then after that, I really wanted to provide the reader with sort of an immersive experience when they're reading my book. So the story doesn't slow down to explain some really simple concepts, simply because I want to grab the reader and have them being propelled along in this ride in a way that feels really authentic. Because you are in the voice, you are in the head, especially with Hannah Khan, it's told in first person. You are in her head. She's not going to stop and explain what every single part of her identity is, because she's living it. So that was my approach.
And you know, it's very different, but it almost reminds me of like if you jump into a fantasy novel and it's not, you don't know the world you're in, you're just sort of in the world, you know, and you figure it out as you go. So I personally really love that choice, because you can make those choices and you can learn, but it also doesn't take you out of the story trying to learn. Rosie, what about you? How did you go about making those decisions?
Yeah, I just think Uzma answered that so well. And so much of what you said resonated with how I tried to approach this book as well. And in terms of the Jewish practices, I will say, so yeah, exactly kind of what you were saying about how these characters should be allowed to live their lives without explanation in the same way that people who are part of the dominant culture get to. And so, and again, like so many of the details inform the story the way world building would. I think that was such an excellent point about if it was a sci-fi book, you would pay attention to the food they were eating or the celebrations they were a part of. And yeah, you can immerse yourself in a different culture in that way as well, even if it's in a contemporary setting. I will say the one thing was that may help readers who are not as familiar with Jewish practice is Naomi is kind of like questioning what her relationship is with Judaism, and she doesn't know as much about it as Ethan does. And she asks him questions, and that's like a really relatable part of my Jewish experience. Like I have a lot of Jewish scholars in my family, and even when I was working on this book, I was like, okay, can we unpack this thing that I read about? And I kind of love that, like the discussion and interpretation is such a part of their relationship. So, you know, again, there are discussions like Naomi literally says like, so can you have sex before marriage? Because I read this other thing on the internet. And Ethan is like, oh, no. Like, so yeah, I think there's both opportunities for you to feel like immersed in another culture, but also that questioning is normal. Like you don't have to know anything. And of course you can always use the internet if there's things that you want to learn more about.
Yeah, and Ethan, even though he's the rabbi, he asks questions and he questions things as well, which I really love. And just the setting of your book, it's like in a classroom almost, like a big lecture hall. Like, so you really do have learning, I think, at the core as well, because you have a bunch of people. I mean, they're trying to learn about, sex and intimacy as opposed to the Jewish faith, but it's still, you're in that environment of, we're here to learn, we're here to ask questions, we're here to figure things out. Andy, what about you in your book?
I think because sort of Catholicism is the theme in a lot of pop culture, I didn't really stop to explain very much. I think a couple of times my editor was like, especially when Patrick was working at the bar, she's like, can he wear regular clothes or does he have to walk around in the collar? He can wear regular clothes. And I kind of wanted Sister Cortona in a habit, even though most nuns don't wear one. So I took some liberties. I did I think the one scene where they're talking in a confessional where Patrick is hiding, because they don't really use confessionals anymore, but it's a historic church. And it's part of what people sign up for when they're going to read a book about a priest. You're going to expect to see a confessional. You're going to expect to see certain things. And so I wanted to fulfill the promise of the premise in a lot of ways. But yeah, I think because Catholicism is and Christianity as a whole is so dominant in the culture, I didn't feel like I had to stop and explain things. And I feel like it's just a part of a lot of my books. And all, when I look back at them, the fact that I grew up Catholic and went to Notre Dame is just, it seeps in there. And it's a part of a lot of the assumptions. But I'm privileged to be able to do that. And so I felt like I'm not going to stop and slow down and explain things, because I feel like that would have slowed down the pacing of the book.
And, I feel you touched on, you almost did the opposite, saying, okay, well, yes, we don't really use confessionals, or nuns do swear, and they can drink, so I feel like you, I guess, shone the light in a different way. Okay, so every book has side characters, family, friends, coworkers. But that being said, in most romance novels, we're focused on just the couple. But something that I loved about each of your books is that we really get to zoom out and see a community overall. In Hannah Khan Carries On, she's got this great close-knit community of the Golden Crescent. And in your book, Rosie, you've got, the people who are taking the seminar series. And Andy, you've got people who are helping to, keep this preschool running, and pulling from the community. And, so we really get to see people outside, not just the focus. And I think that comes with having religion be a theme, is you get to see this larger community. My question is, do you guys have a favorite either scene that showcases this, or a character that showcases this? I mean, Uzma, you already mentioned the funeral rites scene. That was very moving to me, just seeing how a community comes together. And Rosie, and there's a scene where, during a protest, two of the more outspoken people who are taking the class come, and they sort of stand and guard the door. And we really just see these things. So is there a favorite, again, scene or character in this community that sort of balances out the book? Andy, why don't we start with you?
I think Sister Cortana, she's named after a nun who was my great aunt. And so I met this woman a few times. She's nothing like Sister Cortana on the page. I never heard her swear. And I don't think I don't think her backstory is similar. But I just liked the fact that there was a power, a woman who wielded power within this community, in a way that shows that the hierarchy of the church is really messed up. And I wanted to show that Sister Cortona should really be the one running the place. She would be better at it. And so I loved her. And I also loved bringing back a lot of the characters from previous books. I loved writing the friendship between Sasha and Hannah in the first book, and I wanted to show, and I was happy to be able to kind of close the loop on Hannah's story and show how she's grown as a person through her relationship with Jack, and belonging to that sort of tight-knit tiny little community of friends. So.
Yeah, I loved how everyone sort of knew everyone. Because I feel like that's very true to life. Like very rarely do I meet anyone new, especially in a pandemic. So,
right.
You know, having everyone be a friend of a friend was very fun. Rosie, what about you?
I love the scene that you mentioned, because I think like something that readers gravitated towards with Naomi in the first book is she like appears really tough, like she could eat nails for breakfast. And the scene that you're talking about is this community that she's built that she was pretty nervous about. Like she has insecurity about transitioning to like a live teaching environment. Higher academia has not been very welcoming to her. And over the course of this lecture series, she builds these people who are like fiercely protective of her and basically like come to her aid. And I just love the idea of this community that she's made herself so vulnerable in order to build, stood up for her when she needed them. And it's just like a very soft moment. And even like, you know, there's like the physical protection that you were talking about where the guys like kind of block the door and they're like, no, you're not getting in here. I love like tough bros, like being tough. And then there's also like Ethan who like responds in a different way in the same situation where he says to her like, I want to get you out of here, but like, what do you want to do? And he respects her agency, and you know, she makes the choice to stay and he respects that and kind of takes care of what he can for her. And I think both that sort of like traditional display of masculinity and then that sort of subversive display of masculinity, Naomi deserves all of the softness and protection in that way.
Yes, I feel like she's definitely a character who is so used to flying solo. Like even her friendship, and you know, like with her ex and then her best friend slash like business partner, like there was a part where they hugged like for the first time and it's like, what's going on? I don't like this. You know, so she's not really used to, you know, being soft or being vulnerable. And so to see that on such a large scale with a community that she didn't expect to find was really sweet. Uzma, what about you?
Before I get to that, I just realized that all three of us have characters named Hannah in our books.
Yes.
That's so funny, right? Because it's a name that actually is very common among all the three monotheistic religions, Christian. So
I love that.
I know this panel should have been called The Three Hannahs and Religion.
I mean, I actually named her after hard-hearted Hannah. Like, so that was very intentional.
That's so funny. So for me, I tend to write big. So like I tend to have like a large cast of characters when I write my books. And I think that's just a product of being part of a big community and also a big extended family. Like I have a lot of family in Canada who live nearby, and we're always kind of pre-pandemic, we were in each other's faces a lot. And so I tend to have a big cast of characters, and I give them all like very different personalities. So my favorite character outside of the main couple is Kokab Khala. So this is Hannah's aunt who comes to visit her from India. And she's this sarcastic, acerbic woman who has an amazing backstory that really inspires Hannah to sort of pursue her dreams and to become a stronger woman. And I deliberately put a lot of very strong, independent South Asian women in my book. So everyone from Hannah herself to her older sister, to her mother, to her this is her aunt, her much older aunt. And the reason why I did that is because I think a lot of my books tend to be a little subversive, trying to show the flip side to some of the stereotypes that do dog Asian culture, right? Like about the submissive women, whereas like everyone in my family, the women are the most opinionated, and they're all like, you know, kick ass, take no prisoners type of people. So I wanted to kind of capture that energy in Kokab. And she has like this really cool name too, because it's a very like South Asian, back home Indian, like you don't know anyone under the age of 55 who's named Kokab anymore, but it's just got this kind of cool bent to it. So I wanted to do that too. So sort of like Andy and Cortona, like that's a name I've never heard of before, but it's the same idea.
And you know, we got a fan question about her. People wanted to know if she was based on anyone that you really know, anyone in real life.
Yeah, so Kokab has a really interesting backstory, and no spoilers, so you have to read the book to find out. But Kokab is actually based on a real person in my family who her backstory is very similar to what happened at a key moment in her life. This is a great aunt of mine who was living in India, and I want to say probably the 40s or the 50s. She behaved completely against the grain for a woman of her time. Let me just put it that way. And she showed agency, and she took ownership over her own actions. And she kind of decided to make a decision about her life related to marriage that, you wouldn't expect from a woman of her time in India, especially in India. And so this is, the nickname in the book in Urdu is, they call her Bari Bili, which is big cat. And so I have a similar, like my great aunt also had the same nickname. She was called Big Cat. And so I wanted to do kind of, I wanted to pay some homage to her in my book when I wrote about her. But I always want to write about kick-ass women, just like really strong,
Always.
opinionated, powerful women. Yeah.
Yes, and I love reading them. Okay, so I do have one more question, but before I get into it, if people have fan questions in the audience, now is the perfect time to drop them in the chat, so we can dive into those. But we've talked a lot about, faith and religious identity, but you guys all wrote such incredible, balanced, well-rounded characters. So I wanted to know, what is one of your favorite, I guess, personality traits or identity things about your character that's outside of their religion and their faith? Andy, why don't we start with you?
So I think I've talked about this before, but so Sasha, the heroine in Hot Under Scholar, is sort of based on an amalgam of my friends in college. And I think but her family is based on a specific family of a friend who are terrible. And so I just kind of wanted to sort of give that specific friend, and I don't know if she'll read it and recognize her family. I hope she doesn't. But I sort of wanted to give that specific friend such credit for growing past her family's sort of limited vision for her life. So my favorite thing about Sasha is that she's like in therapy and trying to become like a good person. And she like knows that her following like her family's blueprint for what they've planned out for her is not going to make her a good person that feels good about herself. And so she kind of decides she's going to change the trajectory of her life. And I think that's my favorite thing about her. And my favorite thing about Patrick is what a good friend he is. Right? I just love that he's a good friend to like sort of everyone in his life. And he, made that his life's work. So
yeah, I really love Sasha's therapy scenes. I feel like she's always trying to shock her therapist. Almost like, just like, I can't like wait till she hears about this, like you're gossiping with an old friend. And yeah, Patrick, I feel like that's really true because they start out as friends, he and Sasha. Yeah. So that really grows. Rosie, what about you and your characters?
My favorite thing about Ethan, and this is like probably doing his character a disservice, but I really like it, is he's clumsy like a 90s movie rom-com heroine, which I just really loved because like, there were so many movies in the 90s where the heroines were like just falling like all over their feet. And so I really liked giving that to my hero. And for Naomi, I would say, this is like very soft of me, but like, I really like that she is so dedicated to like working on herself, I guess, like in every facet of her life. Like she goes to therapy, she like always wants to learn. And across this book, she's learning how to be vulnerable, and like, it's so hard for her and she hates it a lot of the time. But she's really committed to it. And yeah, I just think that's a quality that I try to emulate, and it's tough.
No, yeah. I mean, I'll say I really related to Ethan. I fall constantly, literally twisted both of my ankles during one vacation. I'm so clumsy. But yeah, I feel like Naomi is really, what's the word I'm looking for? Like failure is almost not an option, and she does whatever she can to succeed. And I think towards the end of the book, she has to like face old demons. And even with that, like she's resistant at first, but she's really like, okay, I'm just going to do this because it's going to help me grow. So I also really love that about her. Uzma, what about Hannah and Aiden?
One of the things I really like about Hannah is that she even though horrible things happen to her, she never really feels sorry for herself. She always kind of pushes herself to move forward, and she doesn't stay within kind of like the pitying phase of her life. And yet that's kind of sort of counterbalanced by she has a little bit of, she's 24 years old. She is sort of like the younger sister who is a little bit of a brat. So she acts like a brat sometimes, and I love that she it was important to me to show a character like her who could be mischievous, and who, sort of does things just to bug her older sister and just to bug her brother-in-law. And she's a little bit impetuous and impulsive, and I really liked writing her. And I think when I was that age, I certainly didn't have half the self-confidence that Hannah does. And for Aiden, one of the fun things to write about him was he's a little bit vain, and so he wears like really expensive shoes. Like he has a pair of like white Gucci sneakers that Hannah does something to, and it was just really funny to show a man who's like, he's very well put together, and he's hot as well, but just the way that the care that he takes with his clothes, I thought was really funny, because oftentimes that's a stereotypical thing that women are accused of being, but he is really particular about his clothing. And of course, I love heroes who are kind of gruff and a little grumpy, so he's got a little bit of that too. So yeah.
Yes, he definitely is. And I like what you said about Hannah, but I feel like when her cousin moves in, she sort of gets a taste of her own medicine, like, oh, I have to deal with this. Like, I'm now the younger, like, I experienced this. Yeah. Okay, great. So we have a couple of fan questions. One is, do you often study theology when exploring religious themes, news stories, or the community around you more often? So I guess, when you're writing these books, how much, I guess, outside research, or is just like, is this part of your everyday life, or was this something that you focused on writing the book? Rosie, we'll start with you.
I did a lot of reading throughout the entire development process, but that was because I was doing a rabbi as a POV character, and the sort of like amount of references and knowledge and experience that he would have within the community was much deeper than like the average person. And so so if I had just been writing Naomi and somebody else, maybe I could have gone more off of like lived anecdotal experience, but I felt it was really important to have a lot of different sort of like pieces to draw from across like Jewish teachings and Jewish tradition. And I hope that I was able to take sort of like disparate pieces from different portions of the tradition and intersperse them in relevant ways into the narrative.
And someone wanted to know if you got any pushback from the Jewish community for featuring a rabbi protagonist in a romance novel.
You know what? I'm very proud to say no, and I haven't gotten a lot of support, including like, this is like one of my favorite stories. I'll be telling this in like a nursing home someday. But before I pitched this book to Berkeley or even my agent, I went to my family and I was like, am I going to get in trouble if the character that I pair Naomi with is a hot rabbi? Like, what do we think? Let's have a little chat about it. And my family was like, you can't do that. Like, we need to talk to the rabbi right now. And in front of me, my aunt typed out an email to our rabbi and was like, this is what Rosie thinks that she's going to do. And he came back almost immediately and was like, who are we to stand in the way of love? And that was pretty much it. And nobody has really said a peep since.
Oh, so. I love that. Andy, why don't we go to you in terms of like, back to theology, like how much research did you do? How much is this part of just like the overall scope of your daily life? Did you have to separate yourself to do this book, or?
I think so. When you go to Notre Dame, you have to take theology. So I sort of went back to some of like the texts that I had read, at school, and sort of went back to sort of my family. Because the arc of the story is sort of Patrick's leaving the church, I think it was more like I focused on the cultural aspects of it. But I did do some research on it, specifically the the sort of preschool storyline, with the issues with the teacher, I read a New York Times story talking about various Catholic parishes that were having problems with upper level, like higher levels of the church's hierarchy in trying to be more inclusive. And so I wanted to incorporate a small, like a parish trying to be more inclusive and having pushback and sort of how that plays out in the hierarchy. And so most of my research involved like, how does a priest go about not being a priest anymore? How does that, like the nuts and bolts of how that works, as opposed to the actual teachings and the faith, because I wanted to try to keep that more sort of general for readers.
Nice. Uzma, what about you? Oh, just like in terms of, how much research you did, or, how much you focused on theology, like outside of when you were writing this book.
Yeah, so I looked up, I looked up like the funeral rites, or like, the things about like the mosque type of things. But for the most part, because the characters aren't really, no one's an imam. Like Aiden is an imam, Hannah isn't a religious leader in any capacity. They're just Muslims living their life. So a lot of it was mostly through lived experience, but like in some of the reflections that like the imam character did give in throughout the book, I did look that stuff up, but a lot of it is just things that I knew, the greetings, the prayers and stuff like that. So not a lot for this book, not for that aspect. I researched other aspects, like for instance, I'm not a podcaster, so I had to look up stuff like that, and radio, I don't know anything about radio, but not the theology.
Nice. So I think last question, which is a fan question, can you all share what you're working on next, and if it will feature any of the characters in these books, or if it's a whole new universe, or just we're greedy, we want to know as much as possible. Rosie, why don't we start with you again?
Oh gosh, I'm laughing because I'm really not very good at pitching this next book yet that I'm working on, but I'll give it my best shot. So my shorthand for it is that it's a 90K epilogue to the song Goodbye Earl by the Chicks. If you haven't listened to it, please listen to it. It is a classic. But the more, I guess, like official log line-ish is that it's about two best friends who are bed and breakfast owners, and they have an opportunity to come into a surprise inheritance. But at the same time, a brooding private investigator checks into the B&B, and he does not know that there is a body buried in the backyard. So it's very different from The Roommate and The Intimacy Experiment. It does not exist in the same world. It does not take place in LA. It's more like Good Girls, if you've watched that on ABC. It's basically like good people who are really bad at crime trying to get away with things. But yeah, I don't know, I've always been so into the like specific brand of like female anger that the Chicks personify, and so this is like a book homage to that.
And Andy, in your book, there's even a line where Hannah says to Patrick, like, "Don't make me goodbye Earl you," which is so funny.
Yeah, so I mean, I think Rosie and I are on a similar mental wavelength. Like we wrote A Priest and a Rabbi, like
Goodbye Earl.
I know, I'm still trying to figure out, I was like, how can we write like a bonus epilogue where Ethan and Patrick meet?
I know, we have to put them in a bar. I really feel
yes,
like
A Priest and a Rabbi walk into a bar.
I need it.
But so Hot Unders College comes out in July, and right now I'm working on a story in a completely different world. It's actually set in Los Angeles. My grandmother in real life was a somewhat well-known jazz singer, and so I wanted to write a story sort of like, what if she had been like my Auntie Mame and I had stayed with her every summer? She got married a bunch of times. And then what if she were still alive, and how would our relationship be? Plus, what if she had like married the father of like the man of my dreams, and so he was my step uncle, and then gotten divorced. And also it's a complicated family story. But like the sort of driving factor is the heroine has a reckoning when another real life thing that happened to me is that when I first moved to DC, I turned on TLC one night to see my law school boyfriend engaged to a girl on Say Yes to the Dress. And I was in a very dark place in my life. And he had said he never wanted to get married. I'm like, what if that had happened when I was like, what if I had like gone back and been like, why didn't she want to marry me? And so I just kind of wanted to write sort of like a heroine sort of coming semi-unhinged, coming to grips with her past with this dude who had rejected her and who she has this sort of enemies relationship with, and like a sort of a wild family story. So I don't know if I'm pitching it well, but she does go back and interview all of her ex-boyfriends along with her childhood crush who and she has great friends, and I think it's gonna be really fun.
You know, speaking of crossovers, I feel like interviewing all of your exes would be perfect for Hannah's podcast. I would listen to that episode immediately. Uzma, what are you working on next?
Definitely. That's such a good idea. I'm going to get on it. So, Rabbi and a priest walk into a bar, and then Hannah interviews both of them. That's going to be
Love it.
I want to, first of all, I want to read both of your books, Rosie and Andy. They both sound so amazing. I feel like so this is my second novel, and I feel like I'm such a slow writer that I'm still kind of in the plotting phase. Like, right, you can't see it, but I have a big bulletin board with like the cue cards of all of the idea right now for my book. And I don't even know what I'm writing. I feel like it's a mix of Persuasion meets Much Ado About Nothing. So a little bit of Jane Austen, a little bit of Shakespeare, but it's set inside this very particular world of Islamic conferences, like Muslim conferences. So picture like a Comic-Con, but everyone is Muslim instead, type of scene. And it's I kind of grew up going to these like massive conferences with like 20,000, 30,000 participants in the United States and in Canada. And it was just like a little microcosm of the Muslim community. And I thought it would be really fun to set a book there. I don't know where it's headed because I tend to be a drafter, and where I think I'm going is not where I end up. And I'm just like very, very beginning into this stage. So stay tuned. More coming.
I'm already hooked though, honestly.
Thank you.
Well, I think we're perfect time, 6:15. I think we can wrap. So everyone, make sure you check out Hannah Khan Carries On, The Intimacy Experiment, and Hot Under His Collar. Thank you for joining.
Thank you so much for hosting.
Oh, well, yes,
Thank you.
Thank you for
Awesome.